Carolyn Walker was 41 when her own family kicked her out of the house where she'd spent 9 years caring for her dying father. Homeless and down to her last few $100s. She spent $50 on an abandoned gas station everyone else was afraid to touch. It looked worthless. But beneath the garage floor was something that had been hidden for 18 years. And when Carolyn uncovered it, everything changed. Stay with Carolyn, because what she found beneath that floor wasn't what anyone expected, and the real story was only beginning. Carolyn Walker had never imagined she would be homeless at 41. For 9 years, she had lived in the same weathered farmhouse outside Johnson City, Tennessee, caring for her father, Thomas Walker, after a stroke left him unable to manage on his own. Before that, Carolyn had worked at an auto parts store in Knoxville and had been saving for a little place of her own. But when Thomas needed her, she came home. She cooked his meals, sorted his medicine, drove him to appointments, and helped him through the long nights when pain wouldn't let him sleep. Her brother David lived in Atlanta. Her sister Patricia had moved to Florida. They called now and then, but Carolyn was the one who stayed. Thomas had spent most of his life repairing tractors and farm equipment. When Carolyn was a girl, she would sit beside him in his workshop, watching those scarred hands bring dead machines back to life. He taught her how to use a wrench before he taught her how to drive. And whenever something seemed beyond saving, Thomas would say, "When something breaks, don't decide it's worthless until you know why it broke." Carolyn thought those words belonged in a workshop. She wouldn't understand what they really meant until after Thomas died. 3 weeks after his funeral, Carolyn stood at the end of the driveway and stared at 6 cardboard boxes, 2 suitcases, and her father's old steel toolbox. The locks had already been changed. The home she had sacrificed 9 years to protect no longer belonged to her. And before winter was over, Carolyn would find herself hundreds of miles away, standing in front of another place everyone else had abandoned. An old gas station in the mountains of West Virginia. Carolyn did not argue when she saw the boxes. Maybe 9 years of caring for a sick man had taught her that some battles only take what little strength you have left. David stood inside the doorway with Patricia behind him. Neither one came outside. Carolyn picked up the first box, then the second. When she reached for her father's toolbox, David finally spoke. "You know this isn't personal." Carolyn stopped. For a moment, she wanted to turn around and ask him what, exactly, could be more personal than taking a woman's home 3 weeks after she buried their father. Instead, she lifted the toolbox into the bed of Thomas's old Silverado. Then she drove away. That first night, Carolyn parked beneath a security light behind a 24-hour grocery store. She folded her coat against the driver's window for a pillow and tried to sleep. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's kitchen, his coffee cup beside the sink, the worn chair where he sat every morning, and David standing in the doorway, as if 9 years could be packed into 6 cardboard boxes. The weeks that followed taught Carolyn how quickly an ordinary life could disappear. She showered at truck stops, washed clothes at laundromats, bought food that didn't need refrigeration. When money ran low, she picked up temporary work wherever she could find it. A starter replacement on an old Ford, a leaking radiator hose, an alternator in a church parking lot. Thomas had taught her enough that her hands could still earn what she needed to keep moving. But by early December, Carolyn was down to $286. One rainy afternoon, she walked into a public library mostly because it was warm. She sat at a computer near the back and searched for cheap rooms, garage jobs, anything that might give her somewhere to begin again. That was when she found the county tax auction notice. Most of the properties were empty lots and collapsing houses. Then one photograph stopped her. An abandoned gas station outside a tiny mountain community called Pine Creek, West Virginia. 2 rusted pumps stood beneath a sagging canopy. Behind them was a 3-bay repair garage, its doors faded and half covered in vines. Minimum bid $50. Carolyn almost laughed. Then she read the warning beneath it. The property had been vacant for 18 years. Old underground fuel tanks might still be buried there, and any environmental cleanup would become the buyer's responsibility. There was a reason nobody wanted it. Carolyn should have closed the page. Instead, she enlarged the photograph. She wasn't looking at the pumps anymore. She was looking through the dirty garage windows, at the workbench, at the repair bays, at a place where a person with a toolbox might still be useful. And suddenly she heard her father's voice. When something breaks, don't decide it's worthless until you know why it broke. Carolyn sat there for a long time. She had spent the last few weeks believing she needed someone to give her another chance. Maybe she had been looking at it backward. Maybe she needed to find something that needed a second chance, too. The next morning, Carolyn filled the Silverado's tank, put Thomas's toolbox behind the seat, and headed north. By late afternoon, the Tennessee hills had given way to the colder mountains of West Virginia. Then Pine Creek appeared around a bend in the highway. A closed general store, a little white church, a handful of houses tucked against the hills, and finally, the gas station. Carolyn pulled onto the gravel and shut off the engine. For several minutes, she didn't move. The place looked worse than the photograph. Much worse. Then she stepped out and began pulling dead vines from the front wall. Underneath them was a line of faded red lettering. Carolyn brushed away the dirt until she could read every word. Nobody leaves here stranded. Her hand stopped. Of all the places she could have found after her own family left her with nowhere to go, she had somehow arrived at a forgotten gas station carrying that promise on its wall. Carolyn didn't know who had painted those words. She didn't know why. And she certainly didn't know that beneath the concrete floor behind her, something had been waiting in the dark for 18 years. But standing there with only $286, her father's toolbox, and nowhere else to call home, Carolyn made her decision. She was going to bid on the gas station. And that $50 decision was about to change everything. The county office was nearly 60 miles from Pine Creek, and Carolyn arrived the next morning before it opened. She sat in the Silverado with both hands around a paper cup of coffee, watching rain slide down the windshield. At 9 o'clock, she walked inside with the auction notice folded in her coat pocket. The clerk behind the counter was an older woman named Martha Bell, with silver hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. When Carolyn pointed to the property, Martha looked at her twice. The old Grady station. Yes, ma'am. You understand why nobody's bidding on it. Carolyn nodded. The underground tanks. Martha lowered her voice. Those tanks scare everybody off. Cleanup could cost more than the whole property is worth. Then she studied Carolyn's worn coat and tired face. You planning to develop it? No. What, then? Carolyn hesitated. I was hoping to live there. Something changed in Martha's expression. She didn't ask another question. There were no other bidders. By lunchtime, after fees and paperwork, Carolyn Walker held a set of rusted keys and a deed to an abandoned gas station she'd bought for $50. That night, she slept inside the repair garage for the first time. Rain tapped against the metal roof. Wind pushed through cracks around the doors. Carolyn lay inside her sleeping bag with Thomas's toolbox beside her. Sometime after 2 in the morning, she woke. Click. Her eyes opened. She listened. Nothing. Then, click. A small metallic sound somewhere beneath the garage. Carolyn sat up. She found her flashlight and followed the sound toward the old workbench along the back wall. But there was nothing there. The next morning, she told herself it had been pipes cooling in the night. For the next 3 days, she cleaned. And slowly, the station began giving up pieces of its past. Behind an office cabinet, she found photographs curled yellow at the edges. Families beside station wagons. Truck drivers holding coffee. A young soldier standing beside an old Chevrolet. And appearing in photograph after photograph was the same tall, narrow-faced man wearing grease-stained coveralls. On the back of one picture, someone had written, "Walter Grady, me 1978. Carolyn began asking around. Everyone over 60 seemed to know the name. Walter fixed my daddy's truck once. He'd come get you at midnight. He wasn't much for talking, but he'd never leave you stuck." An elderly woman told Carolyn something she couldn't forget. Walter never asked how much money you had. He asked how far you still had to go. That night, the clicking returned. This time, Carolyn was ready. She pressed her ear against the concrete. Click, right beneath the workbench. The following morning, she noticed something she had missed before. The workbench wasn't merely sitting on the floor. Someone had bolted it into the concrete. Carolyn fetched her father's tools. One bolt came free. Then another. The last two fought her so badly she nearly gave up. Finally, the bench shifted. Underneath was a rectangular steel plate blackened by decades of grease. Carolyn's heartbeat quickened. There was a recessed iron ring at one end. She hooked her fingers through it and pulled. The plate lifted with a groan. Cold, stale air rose from below. Carolyn shined her flashlight into the opening. There was a narrow cavity beneath the garage floor, and inside it sat a small metal safe. For a moment, she simply stared. 18 years. Whatever Walter Grady had put beneath that floor had been waiting there for 18 years. Carolyn climbed down and wiped the dust from the safe. Beside it lay a leather-bound book and a yellowed envelope. She picked up the envelope first. Across the front, written in a man's heavy, uneven handwriting, were 7 words. For the one who comes after me. Carolyn felt the room go strangely still. She had come to Pine Creek, looking for nothing more than a roof and a place no one could take from her. But kneeling beneath the floor of a $50 gas station, she suddenly understood something. Walter Grady had left this for someone. The question was whether he had somehow known what kind of person would eventually find it. Carolyn carried the leather book and the yellowed envelope upstairs and set them on Walter Grady's old workbench. For several minutes, she didn't touch either one. Then she opened the book. At first, it looked exactly like what she expected a gas station ledger. Dates, names, repairs, amounts. Oil change $8.50. Water pump $42. 2 tires $61. The entries stretched back decades, written in the same steady hand. But near the back, the records changed. Carolyn found page after page of repairs that had never been paid. Beside each one, Walter had written a single word. Forgiven. Mrs. Dalton, alternator. 94. Husband passed in February. Forgiven. Young Marine heading home to Ohio. Fuel and radiator hose. $37. Forgiven. Henderson family. Transmission repair. 3 children. Work's been slow at the mine. $286, though. Forgiven. Carolyn turned another page. Then another. There were hundreds of them. Some were only names and numbers. Others carried a sentence or two explaining why Walter had let the debt go. Carolyn sat down. All her life, She had been taught that debts were supposed to be settled. You gave something. Someone owed you. You sacrificed. Someone should remember. And somewhere deep inside, although she hated admitting it, that was part of what hurt so badly about David and Patricia. Carolyn had given 9 years. When their father needed someone, she stayed. And when she needed somewhere to stand, they had treated those years as though they were worth nothing. But Walter's ledger seemed to tell a different story. Maybe kindness wasn't always something you got back from the person you gave it to. Maybe sometimes it traveled somewhere else. Carolyn finally reached for the envelope. Inside were 3 handwritten pages. Walter explained that when he was 22, returning home after military service, his truck had broken down during an ice storm in the mountains. He had almost no money. A stranger stopped. The man lay beneath Walter's truck in freezing slush for nearly an hour and got it running again. Walter offered him everything in his wallet. The stranger wouldn't take it. Instead, he said, "Don't pay me back. Stop for somebody else." Walter never learned the man's name, but he never forgot him. Years later, Walter opened the station at Pine Creek and painted a promise across the front wall. "Nobody leaves here stranded." He spent the next several decades keeping it. Then Carolyn reached the final page. Walter's handwriting had grown shakier. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone. I don't know who you are. Maybe you're doing well. Maybe you've got nowhere else to go. But if you're the second kind, listen to an old man. Being left behind can make a person hard if you let it." Carolyn stopped reading. Her eyes filled. She looked around the abandoned garage, the broken windows, rusted tools, leaking roof. Then she continued, "Don't let it. Take whatever is in that safe and keep this place standing if you can. Help the next person who comes through scared, broke, or too proud to ask. You don't owe me anything. Just don't let the kindness stop with you." Carolyn lowered the letter. For weeks, she had thought she had come to West Virginia because she needed somewhere to live. Now, sitting inside a gas station everyone else had abandoned, she began to wonder if that wasn't the whole reason. Thomas had taught her how to repair broken things. Walter Grady had just taught her why some of them were worth repairing. And for the first time since losing her father and her home, Carolyn didn't ask herself what had been taken from her. She asked a different question. What could she still give? That question would change everything. Carolyn opened the safe the next morning. Inside, wrapped in old paper and tucked into a cedar box, were savings bonds, silver coins, and cash Walter Grady had put away over the years. When everything was counted and properly valued, it came to a little over 11,000. To Carolyn, it felt like a fortune. She could have rented an apartment, bought a better truck, maybe even driven back to Tennessee and started over somewhere. Nobody knew what had happened to her. Instead, she stood beneath the faded words on the front of the station. "Nobody leaves here stranded," and she made her choice. She would keep the station running. The first person to help her was Roy Jenkins, a 70-year-old retired welder who lived 6 miles up the mountain. Roy arrived one cold morning in an old Ford pickup, walked around the building without saying much, then climbed onto the roof and stared at the sagging metal. "She's rough," he finally said. Carolyn nodded. "Too rough?" Roy looked down at her. "No, rough ain't the same as finished." Something about those words reminded Carolyn of her father. She asked what he would charge to help repair the roof. Roy shook his head. "Walter Grady taught me to weld when I was 17. Wouldn't take a dime for it." He picked up his toolbox. "Figure I'm about 53 years late paying him back." So they went to work. They patched the roof, replaced rotten boards, repaired the garage doors, and brought Walter's old workbench back to life. And as word spread that someone was reopening the Grady station, people began showing up. Not customers. Not at first. People carrying stories. An elderly woman brought a homemade apple pie and told Carolyn Walter had kept her husband's truck running through the winter he lost his job. A retired miner arrived with lumber stacked in his pickup. Then, one afternoon, a gray-haired man named Charles Henderson walked into the garage holding an envelope. "My father used to talk about Walter," he said. Carolyn remembered the name. She opened the old ledger. Henderson family, transmission repair, 286 throws, 3 children, work's been slow at the mine, forgiven. Charles read the entry twice. His eyes filled. "He never told us the amount." Then Charles placed the envelope on the bench. Inside was 286 no. Carolyn tried to hand it back. Charles closed her fingers around it. "I know Walter forgave the debt," he said. "I'm not paying him back." He looked toward the road. "Use it for whoever comes next." That evening, Carolyn found an empty glass jar. She placed Charles's money inside and taped a handwritten label to the front. Stranded Traveler Fund. A week later, the first person who needed it arrived. A 73-year-old widow named Margaret Ellis pulled in driving an aging Buick that was making a terrible whining sound. The alternator was failing. Margaret stood beside Carolyn while she worked and quietly asked what it would cost. Carolyn could tell from the woman's face that even $100 mattered. 2 hours later, the Buick was running again. Margaret reached for her purse. Carolyn looked at Walter's ledger sitting on the shelf. Then at the red words outside, "There's no charge." Margaret stared at her. "Honey, I can't let you do that." Carolyn smiled. "You're not." That night, Carolyn opened a brand new ledger. On the first page she wrote, "Margaret Ellis, alternator and belt, 186 same." She hesitated only a moment before adding one more word. "Forgiven." Then beneath it, "She needs to get home." Carolyn closed the book and sat quietly in Walter Grady's old garage. For the first time since Thomas died, she didn't feel as though she was merely surviving. She had work, she had purpose, and slowly, almost without noticing it, she was beginning to have a community. Carolyn thought she had bought a broken gas station for $50. What she had really bought was a chance to build a life no one could pack into cardboard boxes and leave beside a driveway. But just as Pine Creek began to feel like home, something happened that Walter's letter had warned her about. The state announced plans for a new highway interchange, and overnight, the land nobody wanted became land somebody was willing to fight for. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning. The state planned to rebuild part of the old highway near Pine Creek and add a new interchange less than a mile from Carolyn's station. A private developer was already looking at land for a large travel center. For years, that forgotten corner had been worth almost nothing. Within weeks, people were talking about numbers Carolyn had never imagined. Then, one April morning, a polished black SUV turned onto the gravel. 2 men stepped out. The first was Stephen Grady, Walter's nephew. The second carried a leather briefcase and introduced himself as an attorney representing the developer. Stephen barely looked at the restored garage. "You're Carolyn Walker." "I am. My uncle owned this property." Carolyn set down the wrench in her hand. "Your uncle died years ago." Stephen's jaw tightened. The attorney stepped forward. He explained that Stephen intended to challenge the tax sale. According to him, proper notice had never been given to Walter's family. Then he offered Carolyn a way out. $20,000. 30 days to leave. Carolyn almost couldn't believe it. A year earlier, $20,000 would have sounded like rescue. Now it sounded like something else. A price someone had placed on her willingness to disappear. "If you fight this," the attorney said, "it could become expensive." Carolyn looked past him toward the red words above the garage. "Nobody leaves here stranded." And suddenly she was standing in Tennessee again. 6 cardboard boxes. 2 suitcases. David behind a locked door. She remembered how quietly she had left. How she had told herself silence was dignity, when part of it had really been fear. Stephen glanced around the property. "You paid $50 for this place. We're offering you $20,000. You should be grateful." Something inside Carolyn settled. Not anger. Something stronger. "No," she said. Stephen stared at her. Carolyn's voice remained calm. "The first time somebody decided my home was worth more than I was, I packed my things and walked away." She looked directly at him. "I'm not doing that twice." That afternoon, Carolyn called Judith Harper, a local attorney recommended by the county clerk. Judith spent the next several days digging through old records. What she found was simple. Stephen had been notified. Not once. Several times. Certified letters had been sent concerning the unpaid taxes and foreclosure. Records showed they had reached him. He had chosen not to act when the property was considered worthless and potentially burdened by expensive underground fuel tanks. And there was more. Judith discovered a state cleanup program that could cover most of the cost of removing those old tanks if Carolyn completed the proper environmental process. The thing that had frightened buyers away for 18 years wasn't necessarily a death sentence. It was a problem waiting for someone patient enough to understand it. When Judith explained everything, Carolyn sat quietly. Then she laughed softly. "What?" Carolyn shook her head. "My dad used to say you shouldn't call something worthless until you know why it broke." Judith smiled. "Sounds like your father was a pretty smart man." The final meeting took place inside the garage. Stephen came with his attorney. Judith came with a folder thick with county records. Carolyn brought only one thing: Walter's ledger. When Stephen finally lost his temper, his voice filled the room. "That station belongs to my family." Carolyn opened the ledger. "Does it?" She turned page after page. "Forgiven, forgiven, forgiven." Then she stopped. There, written decades earlier, was the Grady family name. Walter had once paid to repair Stephen's father's truck during a winter when the family had almost nothing. At the bottom, Walter had written, "Forgiven. Family's having a hard year. Don't let the children go without." Stephen stared at the page. His anger disappeared. Carolyn closed the book gently. "Your uncle didn't leave behind a valuable piece of land," she said. "He left behind a way of treating people." She paused. "You walked away when you thought this place was worthless. I didn't." The room went quiet, and in that moment, Carolyn understood how much she had changed. She wasn't the woman standing beside 6 cardboard boxes anymore. She didn't need David's permission to matter. She didn't need Patricia's gratitude for those 9 years. And she didn't need Stephen Grady to agree that she belonged here. For the first time in her life, Carolyn wasn't fighting to make someone choose her. She had finally chosen herself, and she was about to discover that protecting Walter's station was only the beginning of what she had inherited. Stephen Grady's attorney withdrew the challenge 2 weeks later. There was no courtroom battle, no dramatic verdict, just a letter confirming what Judith Harper already knew. Carolyn's deed was valid. The station was hers. When Judith called with the news, Carolyn was underneath an old Ford replacing a fuel line. She listened quietly, thanked her, then slid back beneath the truck and finished the job. A year earlier, she might have celebrated proving someone wrong. Now she understood something better. Winning wasn't watching Stephen lose. Winning was having something worth staying for. That summer, the state cleanup program approved the old gas station for assistance. Crews removed the underground fuel tanks, tested the soil, and cleared the property. The problem that had frightened everyone away for 18 years was finally gone. By early fall, Carolyn could sell gasoline again. Roy Jenkins found 2 refurbished pumps from a closed station farther south, and half the town seemed to show up the Saturday they installed them. When the first customer pulled beneath the canopy and filled his pickup, Roy leaned against the garage door and smiled. Walter would have liked this. Carolyn looked toward the faded photographs hanging inside the office. I hope so. But Pine Creek gave Carolyn something she had not expected. People. Margaret Ellis still came by in her old Buick, usually carrying pie. Charles Henderson stopped whenever he passed through and always slipped something into the stranded traveler fund. Truckers began learning that if they broke down near Pine Creek, there was a woman at the old Grady station who would stay open after dark, and the new ledger kept filling. A retired Army veteran whose pickup overheated 40 miles from home. Radiator hose, coolant. Forgiven. A young mother traveling with 2 children and a flat tire. Patch and inspection. Forgiven. They have a long way to go. An elderly couple whose alternator failed after sunset. Carolyn repaired it while Roy made coffee. Forgiven. Get them home safe. Then, one afternoon, Carolyn's phone rang. It was David. She almost didn't answer. They hadn't spoken in months. I heard about your gas station, he said. Carolyn waited. And I heard that land might be worth quite a bit now. There it was. For years, Carolyn had imagined what she would say if David ever came back. She had rehearsed angry speeches in her head. She wanted him to understand what those 9 years had cost her. But standing behind Walter Grady's workbench, Carolyn suddenly felt no need to explain herself. David cleared his throat. Maybe we should talk about what happened with Dad's house. Carolyn looked around. Roy was showing a teenager how to change brake pads. Margaret had left a pie cooling beside the coffee pot. A trucker Carolyn had helped weeks earlier was putting $20 into the traveler fund. These people owed Carolyn nothing, and yet somehow, they had become the people who stayed. I hope you're doing well, David, she said softly. Then she ended the call. Not because she hated him, because she finally understood that forgiveness and permission were 2 different things. She could forgive David without giving him the power to decide her worth again. That evening, Carolyn sat outside the station as the Appalachian hills turned gold beneath the setting sun. Thomas's little wrench rested in her pocket. Walter's old ledger sat beside the new one. 2 books, 2 generations, 2 men who had never met, and 1 woman carrying something forward from both of them. Carolyn had once believed her inheritance was the farmhouse David and Patricia took from her. She knew better now. Thomas had left her his patience, his hands, and the ability to see value in things other people discarded. Walter had left her something different, a reason to use those gifts for somebody else. The family Carolyn was born into had taken away her house. But here, inside a $50 gas station nobody wanted, strangers had given her something much harder to buy. A home. And every night before Carolyn closed the garage, she left the light beneath the canopy burning a little longer, just in case someone was still out there, trying to find their way home. Carolyn Walker's story was never really about a $50 gas station. It was about what happens when life takes away the things we thought made us secure: our home, our family, even our sense of where we belong. For 9 years, Carolyn gave without keeping score, and when the people closest to her failed to value that sacrifice, she could have allowed the hurt to make her bitter. But Walter Grady's old ledger taught her something different. Not every act of kindness comes back from the person who received it. Sometimes it keeps moving. from one stranger to another, from one generation to the next. Thomas taught Carolyn how to repair broken things. Walter taught her that some of the most important things worth repairing are people who have begun to believe they no longer matter. Carolyn lost the house she thought was her inheritance, but she discovered that her father's true inheritance had been inside her all along: his patience, his strength, his compassion, and his ability to see value where others saw only something broken. And maybe that's the lesson worth carrying with us. What was done to you does not have to become what you do to others. Sometimes the greatest way to heal from being abandoned is to become the person who refuses to leave someone else behind. If Carolyn's story touched your heart, subscribe and share this video with someone who needs a second chance today. And tell us in the comments, has a stranger's kindness ever changed your life? Because sometimes kindness is never repaid. It's simply passed forward.